Is the ceasefire over? A terrorist opens fire on Israeli troops on the humanitarian route in Gaza. Hours later, 5 senior Hamas leaders are dead. 17 more hunted down in Rafah's tunnels. Now, Hamas is enraged and threatening to end the truce. Israel says it's Hamas who broke the deal. But was this retaliation or the beginning of a full-scale escalation? Stay with us here on Jerusalem Minute. It starts now. Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Haston, correspondent for JNS News, along with Alex Trayman, CEO of JNS. Alex, top story this week. We started talking about this last week. The United Nations Security Council, they approved President Trump's 20-point resolution, his peace plan. Trump congratulating the world, saying this will go down as one of the biggest approvals in the history of the United Nations, leading to further peace all over the world. Hamas immediately rejects the plan. The Palestinian Authority, actually, they were happy with the plan. And we'll talk about the fact, we also brought it up last week, that it mentions a so-called Palestinian state in the resolution.
Right. We talked about how Russia and China were presenting their own version of the resolution. They abstained from the vote, allowing this vote to pass by a vote of 13-0. And I do think that there are some key benefits of this resolution. The first is that the resolution talks primarily about the need for Hamas to disarm and for Gaza to be demilitarized. These are the major tenets of the plan. So that anybody that wants a plan to keep Hamas in power, which Russia did. It looked like China was supporting the Russian view on this. They didn't get a win here in the United Nations. And it's not to say this is a perfect resolution. I don't think any are. I think by and large, this is a very symbolic resolution. It is a resolution on a facade that really doesn't carry much weight, because I don't see who is actually going to disarm Hamas. Hamas is not going to disarm itself. You know, we talked a little bit about in the past about how the Qataris and the Turks, you know, they wanted to see phase one of this deal, which would see Hamas actually releasing the hostages, because that would actually save Hamas, right? Stage one, phase one of this deal saves Hamas, because it forces Israel into a ceasefire position when Israel was right on the cusp of going ahead and finally destroying Hamas. So it basically stops the IDF in the tracks, understands that releasing the hostages is what needed to happen in order to get the IDF to stop in its tracks. But the same forces, the Qataris and the Turks, they don't want to see phase two of this deal, because phase two of the deal is the disarmament of Hamas and the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. So while phase one actually protects Hamas in the short term, phase two calls for basically the elimination of Hamas. So you're not going to see the Qataris and the Turks pushing for the disarmament or the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. And what that actually means is that this ceasefire is standing on very fragile ground.
Oh, absolutely. Things really heating up down there in Gaza. Continuous violations by Hamas of the ceasefire. You have terrorists who are attacking IDF positions. The Prime Minister's office announced last night that 5 senior terrorists were killed. At the same time, Hamas still holding the 3 bodies of the Israelis they murdered. And the IDF this week eliminated the Hamas battalion commander of the Zaytun neighborhood. And at the same time, Hamas says that they are furious at Israel. They call it Israeli aggression. Of course, we know this is self-defense. That's what the IDF is doing, demanding that mediators intervene in order to prevent a collapse of the ceasefire. So Hamas is essentially threatening that they are going to call off the ceasefire because really of Israel's self-defense.
Well, I think that Hamas is going to call off the ceasefire because they're not going to disarm themselves, right? So, and we've seen the videos. You saw a video this week of somebody getting out of a Jeep over the yellow line, coming out armed, the IDF then quickly responding and killing. You know, Hamas is trying to reassert its power in the areas that it still controls in the Gaza Strip. Now, this isn't across the entirety of Gaza, because we know that Israel controls 53% of the Strip. It controls the northern corridor between Gaza and Israel. It also controls the southern corridor between Gaza, and Egypt. And as long as Israel controls that corridor, the Philadelphia route near Rafah, and doesn't allow Hamas to have a channel to rearm itself, to restock its supplies, you see Hamas in this cornered position. They're basically like a cornered tiger, right? And they're wounded tiger at that. But they're going to keep lashing out. It would probably be in their best interest to just calm down and to lay low for an extended period and to actually get the IDF forced to pull out by the international community. But as long as they continue to be operating in the method which they are, which is these like limited attempts to strike at the IDF, what you're going to see is that the United States and others are going to be backing Israel's claims that Hamas is violating the terms of the ceasefire. And I think that there is actually an agreement and understanding. And all along this war, especially since Trump has gone into office, what I have seen personally in just covering the relationship between Israel, the Israeli administration led by Netanyahu, and the Trump administration is that there is significant coordination, on all these fronts, whether that was calling for the ceasefire in Lebanon, calling for the ceasefire in Iran, the strikes on Iran to begin with, the strikes on the Houthis, and even the calling of this ceasefire and what this 20-point plan looked like. I think that most of these points of the plan, let's say 17, 18 points of the Trump 20-point plan were actually authored by Israel. So I think that there's a lot of coordination here. And I think that what's happening is that Netanyahu and the IDF are willing to give Trump's plan an opportunity to succeed. And obviously, we know that Trump wants it. Trump wants to be seen as the peacemaker, the one that brought this conflict to an end. But I think that there's a timetable. And if within a period of, let's say, 2 months, 3 months from now, you don't see that Hamas has turned into a nice neighbor, which they're a terrorist organization and they're not likely to, I think that there's going to be a green light for Israel to go back in and to attack Hamas in their consolidated position, in their isolated position, and to finish off Hamas once and for all.
A lot of stuff going on in Gaza and Lebanon as well, with Hamas trying to attack Israel from Lebanese territory. The IDF on Wednesday morning struck a training compound of Hamas in southern Lebanon. At the same time, the IDF is reporting that Hezbollah, the terrorist organization in Lebanon, is rebuilding their capabilities. According to the IDF, they've been working to rebuild in the village of Beit Leaf in southern Lebanon, in a blatant violation of the understandings between Israel and Lebanon. So looks like, once again, we spoke about it, I think, several weeks ago, but the IDF now saying Hezbollah trying to rebuild their capabilities to strike Israel from Lebanon.
Well, you see that the IDF is acting on a regular basis in southern Lebanon. It's, these little isolated strikes. Whenever they see a movement, they're striking. This is really called the mowing the grass. But what we're seeing is that you're taking out the lawnmower every day, and that Hezbollah is getting more aggressive, and they have more abilities to rebuild their capabilities than Hamas does in Gaza. And so what we're seeing is that Hezbollah wasn't reduced to the same capabilities that Hamas is. Certainly, Hezbollah's long-range missile capabilities were reduced significantly. Certainly, their presence towards the south of Lebanon, near the Israeli border, that was moved, and Hezbollah is now further up, but we're in Lebanon. But we're seeing that they are trying to rebuild, and I think that is, in terms of the Israeli assessment, is that Hezbollah does still remain a more potent fighting force and a greater threat to Israel than Hamas does in Gaza. So on the one hand, we're seeing perhaps a timetable and a potential return to fighting in Gaza, and now you're also seeing it in the north. And I think that this actually puts into context some of Netanyahu's thinking regarding going to an election. Remember, we had, right after the ceasefire was declared, the thinking that perhaps Netanyahu would go into a snap election because he was riding a high, and the Israeli public, were pretty happy that the hostages came home, and it looked like that Netanyahu had ended the war. But now what we're seeing is that what we got to was a pause. We did get our hostages back, but that the war may not be over because our enemies are not comfortable with even what you would call the 5 to 10 year hudna, right? Okay, we're going to ceasefire now for 5 years, for 10 years. If Hamas and Hezbollah were demonstrating that they were going to lay low for an extended period, I don't know if we would see a rush back into conflict. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing Hezbollah and Hamas both trying to reassert power, both trying to rebuild their capabilities to whatever degree that they can. And so for Netanyahu, he's looking at this period now. He has a year until the next elections are scheduled. And he wants to run again. So he doesn't want to leave this war in a situation of limbo where he called a ceasefire, but now a next government's going to have to come in and to reassert Israeli control or finish the war off. And so I think that there is a general understanding between Netanyahu in the Trump administration, whereby you have a period now of 12 months to the elections. So the timetable is not long. Netanyahu wants to see this war completed before he goes to an election. So we're giving this a period of, let's say, 2 to 3 months in the South to see if anybody else manages to disarm Hamas and demilitarize Gaza. It's clear that as Marco Rubio said last week, that there's no international stabilization force that's going to disarm Hamas. So that leaves only one force to do it. That's the IDF, and you're seeing the same situation in the north. So I think that you have a likelihood of a restarting of conflict. It doesn't mean as large necessarily as it was previously. And then you also have to look at Iran, because we're seeing that Iran is also rebuilding their ballistic missile capabilities. And this does represent an existential threat. We also have good reason to believe that during the 12-day war that Israel was running out of its stock supply of the Arrow interceptors. And so it was in Israel's best interest at that time to see a ceasefire. So now you have a race going on. Israel trying to restock in this period of a ceasefire all of its military capabilities, offensive and defensive, particularly with regard to missile defense and Arrow capabilities on the one. But the Iranians also racing to reproduce their ballistic missiles, and also even more important than the quantity of the missiles is their missile launching capabilities, something that Israel hit hard on. So basically what you're seeing is you had these three major fronts, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, all of them significantly degraded, but none of the enemies of Israel taking the hint that they lost the conflict, all of them trying to rebuild. And unfortunately, the way things are going, I think that you could see an open, active round two of this conflict in the not-so-distant future.
Let's take a look at the broader Middle East. You mentioned Iran. At the same time, you had the Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, visiting with President Trump in the White House this past week. The prince mentioning that Saudi Arabia wants to be a part of the Abraham Accords, normalization with Israel, but he mentioned, again, a two-state solution. Let's check out this video.
Are you going to bring up the Abraham Accords in your discussion?
I already brought them up. We believe having a good relation with all Middle Eastern countries is a good thing, and we want to be part of the Abraham Accord. But we want also to be sure that we secure a clear path of two-state solution.
So then you see the President of the United States, Trump, and the Saudi prince, a healthy discussion as it was described. The prince there mentioning a two-state solution in regard to, or lumping the two together, two-state solution, normalization agreement. And we've said it in the past, you have to take that comment with face value. Do we think the prince is going to push aside normalization if a two-state solution doesn't exist? Now let's just talk about the overall importance of this meeting. Last week we mentioned the F-35s and the sale to Saudi Arabia, which looks like it's moving forward. Let's talk about that meeting in Washington.
Well, we had previously talked about, the Saudi relationship with President Trump, and knowing that the Saudis, wanted things like the F-35s, and also they got an announcement of a special, basically, defense alliance, a strategic alliance between Saudi and the United States, which was similar in a way to what Qatar managed to succeed to get this executive order stating that Qatar is a special strategic ally of the United States. And we always thought that Trump was going to demand normalization with the Saudis in order for these things. And here they've gotten the cart without the horse, so to speak. They've gotten everything that they've wanted in terms of the F-35s without having to normalize with Israel. Now, you can look at what we were just talking about before as the reason why Saudi Arabia is not rushing into a normalization agreement. And the Saudis, ultimately, end of the day, what they were telling Israel is they wanted Israel to defeat this entire network and to completely wipe out Hamas. And what do they see in Gaza? They see Hamas is still there. They see that the war is not necessarily over. They see that Hezbollah continues to rebuild their capabilities. So Saudi Arabia is not going to rush into normalization before the war is completed. If you recall, one of the reasons why Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran stated that they went into this war was because they were trying to prevent this Saudi normalization. So the Saudis are not going to jump in first until Israel finishes the job. Once Israel finishes the job, now there's no more Hamas, right? If that's finished, okay, if there's no talk about the creation of a Palestinian state, then the Saudis will perhaps say, well, this Palestinian state is not possible, and we're not going to allow for this lack of a pathway toward a Palestinian state to block normalization. But as long as the international community talks about a Palestinian state, as long as the Trump 20-point peace plan talks about a pathway to a Palestinian state, and as long as this war is not over completely in the South and with Hezbollah and with Iran, then the Saudis are not going to be more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak. So they're just following the language of everybody else, and they're also using this lack of a pathway toward Palestinian state as the excuse for why they're not racing into normalization.
So in regard to that Palestinian state, you have politicians and others here, activists here in Israel, upset that the words Palestinian state, or even in the document, the Trump plan, you had those politicians, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and others, criticizing the prime minister and trying not to criticize President Trump publicly, but saying there will never be a Palestinian state and it shouldn't even be mentioned any sort of documentation. Prime Minister Netanyahu, by the way, welcoming that the passage of the UN Security Council vote this past week. And some people mocked him, saying that he welcomed it, only said it in English when he took to, I think, social media or publicly accepting the UN or congratulating President Trump on that. Is there any significance to that, or is that just, just another attempt to go after Prime Minister Netanyahu? And what's your thoughts on these politicians are saying they don't even want to see the words Palestinian state?
Well,
it's scary to them.
I can certainly understand why Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and much of the Israeli public doesn't want to hear anything about the creation of a Palestinian state. I think if you poll Israelis, what you'll find is that the overwhelming majority of them, and that's not just what would be called, the right flank of the Israeli political spectrum, even like the center Israel, and even people that would consider themselves voting for left-wing parties would not want to see the creation of a Palestinian state right now. Although I do think that they understand that, this is a situation that Israel, the United States, everybody brought upon themselves with the creation of the Oslo Accords back in the 90s and all the talk about two-state solution. Israel hasn't figured out how to slam the door on it, even though the prime minister has been very adamant in the last period that there's not going to be a Palestinian state, and that's not going to be the reward for October 7th, and it's not going to happen on his watch. Okay, so if you look specifically at the 20-point plan, what it talks about is a pathway to Palestinian state, under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, only and if the Palestinian Authority undergoes reforms that nobody actually believes that the Palestinian Authority is going to undergo. So, I think that the Palestinian state component is a bit of a window dressing. It was designed in order to get the Qataris and the Turks and others to isolate Hamas. That's happened, okay? But I don't really see at this point any pathway towards Palestinian statehood, even though they have this unspecific reference. They talk about a pathway towards. They don't talk about the immediate creation of, and we don't know where that Palestinian state ultimately would be created. And it doesn't say specifically that it has to be in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. So there's a sort of vague references to Palestinian statehood. I understand why the right wing is upset about it. I also understand why they're doubling down on it, because they know that an election is coming. And they want to make sure that they're grabbing all of the ideological votes in the upcoming election. So they have to stand firm on their ideology, which at its core is to oppose Palestinian statehood and to promote sovereignty in Judea and Samaria.
Speaking of Judea and Samaria, unfortunately, we had a deadly terrorist attack this past week. A 71-year-old man from Kiryat Arba was murdered at the Gush Etzion Junction. 3 other Israelis wounded. Aaron HaKohen from Kiryat Arba. Why was he murdered? He was murdered because he was a Jew and he was waiting for a bus. He was waiting for a ride home. 2 terrorists arrived, one from Hebron, one from a village in the area. and proceeded to carry out a car ramming attack. They rammed into their victims, and then they got out of their cars and tried to stab any Jews in the area. And unfortunately, Aaron Cohen was murdered in that attack. We'll talk a little bit also about the whole issue of so-called settler violence in a minute here, because a lot of people are tying those things together. Let's be clear, first of all, these people wanted to murder a Jew. It had nothing to do with so-called settler violence. They have an excuse for everything. When Jews build in Judea and Samaria, when there are more houses, when there, these accusations of settler violence, they'll use any excuse, but that's not the reason they're going out and carrying out these attacks. They want to murder Jews, and anybody who says that Hamas or these terror organizations don't exist in Judea and Samaria have no idea what the reality is. So unfortunately, another terrorist attack. We just had one several months ago, a murderous attack at the Gush Etzion Junction. They actually really enhanced the security in the area, but unfortunately, while the IDF stops 90+% of these types of attacks, this one got through.
Well, the Gush Etzion Junction has been a hotspot for attacks, like you've said. We've seen it over and over again. We remember several years ago when Ari Fold was stabbed, at the shopping center at the Gush Etzion Junction. And so this has been a hotspot. It's, the IDF can do whatever they want to try to stop these attacks. But when you're talking about a car ramming at a bus stop, what does that mean? That means that there's a steady flow of traffic. This is a high traffic area.
Arabs and Jews using the same roads.
And all of a sudden, a car that's just driving at the normal highway speed, and let's face it, you could talk about this. Arabs drive very erratically in the area. That's not to say that, by the way, some Jews also drive very erratically, because they see that's the culture of driving. So you have erratic driving in the area. You have cars going fast. You have cars zipping in and out, changing lanes, oftentimes without blinkers. And then what you have at a car ramming is you have Jews basically standing at a bus stop, either waiting for rides or waiting for a bus. They're just standing there waiting, and sitting ducks, at these right next to the side of the road. And then you just have an Arab terrorist just basically speeding up and taking a quick right turn and there's no way to prevent that, because you can't identify, 200 yards away who that terrorist is going to be, if there's going to be a terrorist at all. And it's not even necessarily certain that that the terrorist is even going to strike at that time. They're motivated. They've been motivated. They're not necessarily dispatched, right? It's not like a terrorist organization said, okay, today you're going to go hit this bus stop here. People are incited from birth, childhood, as part of the society to do this. And, somebody's holding a knife in their car. They're thinking about it. Maybe they've had that knife in their car for a month. Who knows? And then all of a sudden they decide, okay, I see a crowd of people at the junction. I'm going to do it. And then they just do it. And this is what happens. And, we saw a video of the father of one of these terrorists, basically saying, that, and he was saying it like in a complete shell-shocked way. I couldn't believe it, actually. He was saying it like he knew that this is what he was supposed to say. Even though that didn't look like how he felt, that it was his greatest honor that his son would become a martyr, right? So you see that there's like a death cult in the society where, this is what a father of a terrorist is supposed to say, after his son gets killed, that he could not be prouder than that his son became a terrorist, right? So you see here that there is a death cult, and that there is a lack of international condemnation about it. You don't see the French and others putting pressure, on Hamas, on the Palestinian Authority to rein in terror. Why? Because they know it's not going to happen. Not only do they know that the Palestinian Authority is not going to stop it, they just watch idly as the Palestinian Authority and Hamas incite it. But sure enough, if there's a Jew that goes out and takes a reactionary attack, then all of a sudden everybody goes crazy, because that's not how Jews are supposed to act. But the Jews are looking and they're saying to the IDF and to the government, you're not keeping us safe. And unfortunately, they are taking, oftentimes, not all the time, but we have seen a steady stream of hilltop youth, as they're called, young settlers that just see the situation as being completely unjust, saying, hey, two can play at this game. Now, there's a big difference, and we talked about this on the show in the past, is that Israel has an army, right, to fight terror, and Israel does not encourage vigilante actions. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas, they actually promote vigilante action. That's what they want. This terrorist was a vigilante. It wasn't part of an organized army. It was just somebody that was encouraged to go do this. So Jewish people, the state of Israel does not encourage any of its youth to go out and to carry out acts of counter-terror.
The PA, by the way, did you see how they reported this terrorist attack? Of course, they don't mention terror. They said Israel went out at the Gush Etzion junction and murdered 2 minors. Now, why is that important? Because the UN then takes what happened, the fact that the IDF, the 2 terrorists were killed, the IDF killed 2 terrorists. What do they chalk that up to? They call that settler violence. It's unbelievable.
Exactly.
It's the IDF defending, carrying out this, taking out these 2 terrorists before they murder more Israelis. That's called settler
That's
violence.
what the IDF does it.
Yeah, that's what the IDF does it, and the UN chalks it up per their statistics as settler violence, and the PA, of course, says that this was an unprovoked attack by Israel. So
And
they're
unfortunately,
in cahoots.
international diplomats fall for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
We've seen it. We've seen it here. I mean, we had this episode a few months back where there was the accusations of so-called settlers setting fire to a church, in the Palestinian-controlled territories in Samaria, and then you even had the ambassador to the United States ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who in general I think has just been fantastic, but in one area where I think he made a critical mistake, he went out to this church and he talked about whoever did this, was a terrorist, and the implication is that Jews did it, but as it turned out, Jews were not doing that at all. In fact, Jews were out there trying to put out the fire that was being set. And oftentimes what you have here is what you see the reports of. It says masked settlers going out and committing acts of violence or spray painting or smashing windows or setting a car on fire. And then what you see is that the left-wing NGOs complain that there's not arrests. Right? How come there's not arrests? There's not arrests because in many cases, these might have been false flag attacks where it wasn't committed by Jews. Okay, that you have Arabs putting on masks, will smash cars in their own territory.
Yeah, burning their own fields. I've seen it myself. Burning their own fields and then blaming
the Jews for it, and people fall for it. And so what happens is, yes, there are some cases where Jews have done it, but then there's also cases where Jews have not done it. And like you said, there's also cases where an Arab is a terrorist, and then the IDF or a civilian responds, because we know that many times it's civilians that actually neutralize terrorists, like let's say at this bus stop. Okay, so you have a car ramming attack, and then the terrorist gets out of the car with a knife, starts stabbing people. There's somebody else at the bus stop, a civilian with a pistol, which he has specifically for that purpose, who neutralizes the terrorist, and then that's called settler violence.
Absolutely.
So you have to put this all into perspective, and you have to think twice and use your thinking cap, when you're looking at what is the so-called settler violence and who actually committed it, and what is also the purpose of magnifying these so-called settler violence attacks. It's meant to, distract against the Palestinian Authority, and then sometimes there's also domestic considerations as well.
Yeah, it's lumping 500,000 law-abiding, army-serving citizens of the state of Israel, the so-called settlers, into one group. And I think you did a great job of describing why that's absolutely not true and not fair.
And you talked about how this week also the Israeli government took out some outposts.
Yeah, this was in eastern Gush Etzion. From my understanding, actually, the mayor of Gush Etzion, a lot of people are very upset with Yaron Rosenthal, the mayor of the Gush, who ordered that called in the civil administration and the IDF to take down a fledgling new community in eastern Gush Etzion. I believe there's 25 families living there, and his rationale was that this area will be approved for a future big community down the road. But the images of Jews throwing other Jews out of their homes, especially when this wasn't a necessity, the building of this new community isn't going to take place for 5-10 years. And a lot of people not happy with the leadership there, Jews taking out other Jews from their homes. And it does not do us a favor on the PR front in the international community.
Well, you do see that there is a major battle for land in Judea and Samaria. You see Palestinians, they don't need permits to be building in areas A and areas B. And what we also see is that they take land in area C as well. The area C is the areas that's supposed to be under Israeli jurisdiction, under Israeli administrative control and military control. But we see that Palestinians do stake out strategic areas. And let's remember that the Judea and Samaria, these are the hills of Israel. And so sometimes being on top of a hill is a strategic location. Sometimes being in a valley is a strategic location. And we see how Palestinians are building up as close as they can to Israeli communities, right? So sometimes you have Israeli community, like let's take, for example, the northern border of Efrat, okay? And so you see that there's a fence, that Israel puts a fence around its community to provide safety for the residents of the community. And then what the Palestinians do is that they will start building illegal houses all the way up to that fence. And what that does is that it prevents the future expansion of that community. And they don't need permits to do that. And so you see these battles taking place where Jews will actually try to put some homes on a strategic hill, but they'll do it without a permit because they're not getting permits for that. Now, I understand why, from an administrative perspective, people are opposed to this, even in Israel. And even, like you said, the mayor of Gush Etzion opposes this because when they see that young families just coming out and building rogue houses, what it does is it kind of puts them in the same basket of morality as the Palestinians that are illegally taking land. It makes it harder for future governments to want to approve land because they feel like they're giving credence to what the left wing will call these like wildcat outposts, right? That all of a sudden the people are just taking the law into their own hands. And I think that the communities in Judea and Samaria, they want to be able to communicate back to the Israeli public and to the international community that we're law-abiding citizens. So, if you see people going out here and doing extra administrative land grabbing, it doesn't create a great image on the one. On the other hand, like, how come the administrative council is not actively saying, no, we're behind this. We're creating this as an administrative zone that we're taking responsibility for. This is a strategic section for the entire region, and we're going to do it. So, I see why they're against these building of outposts. On the other hand, they have to be more aggressive in the expansion of their communities. Now, I would say that in this last period, there has been aggressive administrative expansion of communities, and the United States is basically giving a tacit green light for this to happen. We talked about this maybe about a month ago on the program.
Mr. Smotrich approving a lot of homes.
Right, and we saw Prime Minister Netanyahu going to a ceremony in the E1 community near Ma'ale Adumim, which would be a massive expansion of community between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, which is over the green line. So we have seen the United States is giving a green light to Israel to approve things legally. So perhaps what the mayor of Gush Etzion is saying is, look, they're giving us a green light to approve things legally, so let's follow the process. We're actually doing a lot of building. We're expanding in a legal way. Let's just continue to do it in a legal way. As far as people like you and me are concerned, on the one hand, we might cheer on 20-year-old families, that go out there onto the hilltops. On the other hand, you and I are not going to just be able to go and take a plot of land that we like in the beautiful hills and build our dream house there because we follow the regulations.
So Gush Etzion, by the way, establishing the new community of Shtema, which is very close to Tekoa on the road to Jerusalem a day after this event, in order to establish a presence on the ground. I remember Nadia Matar years ago set that up. It was an old military base, and now it looks like there are actually a few homes up there, caravans, but it looks like people are going to be up there.
This is a dance, that the communities are playing with the administrative officials, both in the Gush Etzion region and in the national government and the international government. But I think that there's something else here that we have to address, which is when you do hear more and more about settler violence creeping into the headlines, and then you see all of a sudden that the government goes ahead and knocks down a community. What they're doing is that they're actually sending a signal to the U.S. administration that they're cracking down when they're getting pressure, that the international community is talking about settler violence, this and that, so then the Israeli government needs to demonstrate that they deal with this, or they feel that they need to demonstrate. I'm not sure. Perhaps they should just say, hey, this is our land, and we're gonna build on it, and it will be up to us to decide whether we enforce administrative code or not. They certainly don't enforce administrative code against Palestinians. They certainly don't enforce this administrative code, as robustly against Bedouins that basically live almost everywhere, hundreds of thousands of them, without administrative regulations and planning. So they kind of feel like they have to show the international community. On the other hand, the left wing loves this because what have you been seeing in the weeks before? What you're seeing is more and more is that domestic attention is focused on the military advocate general, right? How she leaked the information, the clips, and doctored those clips about what was going on in the State Taman military prison in the south. You have talks about how the attorney general might have been involved in that. You see that the left wing is losing its status, among even centrist voters. And so all of a sudden, the media harps on right-wing settlers or on Haredi, protests against draft dodging. They have these issues that they like to bring back into the front page of the headlines to distract attention away from what might be actually much more serious systemic issues on the left.
Alex, speaking of the left, did you know that the protests on Saturday nights in Tel Aviv are still going on? We were told these were protesting, trying to get the hostages back. Well, all the live hostages, thank God, are back. 3 deceased hostages still being held by Hamas. But the Kaplan protests, as we predicted, by the way, are still continuing on a regularly scheduled weekly basis. And now those who are protesting are saying that the reasoning they're still on the streets in Tel Aviv every Saturday night is that they want an official inquiry into the October 7th massacre. We saw the opposition heads, we saw Lapid, we saw even Naftali Bennett was out there last night, part of the Kaplan group. So why are the protests, for those people who don't understand, why are those protests still happening? The hostages are back. It's a fragile ceasefire, but the ceasefire is taking place. Shouldn't they be at home? Shouldn't it be over? Why is it still going on? We talked about this.
Well, like we talked about, number one, these protests did not start with the taking of hostages on October 7th.
Exactly.
In fact, the protests actually led Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran to thinking that Israel was in a vulnerable state. These protests were over, at the time, judicial reforms, but before that, they were pointing towards Netanyahu, saying that he should resign over the investigations and the indictments, that people should not vote for Netanyahu in the consecutive election cycles, and they pivot. We explained over the weeks and years, why they pivoted to focus on the hostages, because they felt this was a silver bullet issue that all Israelis could agree on. This was a focus-tested issue. This would help the movement restore credibility after they tried to tear the country apart over the judicial reforms, and that they also hedged that Netanyahu would not deliver and would not be able to get the hostages back. Basically, that Netanyahu would fail to bring them home. Well, guess what? Netanyahu did deliver, and the hostages are back. And when we talk about this temporary ceasefire, like we were talking about at the beginning of the show, this was primarily done for reason number one, to get the hostages back. Reason number two, to allow Israel time to rebuild its arsenals. Reason number three, to let a lot of the soldiers who have been fighting for 2 years straight, get a little bit of a respite, and to see if the international community could go and take this to the finish line. But understanding, as Netanyahu said, always, that this can be done the easy way or the hard way. It can be done by the ceasefire resolution, and the international community can do it, or the IDF is going to do it. And we're seeing now more and more that it appears that the IDF is going to do it. So the members of this hostage forum, they said it. They said the second the hostages came back, no, this doesn't mean that the protest movement is over.
Right.
So what they're basically doing is that they're showing their stripes. They're basically telling you that the hostages was just a flavor of the day. We were using this. There's an argument that can be made, a sick and a cynical argument, that the organizers of the hostage movement protests actually didn't want Netanyahu to succeed and bring the hostages home. And they just were going to continue to ride that, whether that was going to be for 2 years as it was, or if it was going to be for 5 years or 10 years, and just say Netanyahu failed to bring them home. Now that Netanyahu brought them home, so they're focus testing, they're pivoting to the next thing, and they see by their tests that the Israelis want to see a commission of inquiry. So now they're saying that the protests are focused on getting a commission of inquiry into the causes of the war established. And here you have like a major disagreement between the left and the protesters and the government, right? At this point, the government, Netanyahu is stating that he does want and he's ready to establish a government-based commission of inquiry led by the Justice Minister. Justice Minister Yariv Levin being the one who would oversee the selection of the panelists that would conduct conduct this commission of inquiry. And what the government is proposing is basically a 50-50 split in the creation of this committee, basically 50% that the government picks and 50% that the opposition picks. And if you look at it, well, doesn't that make sense? You know, the government wants to protect itself. The opposition's got its own agenda. So let's make a commission of inquiry that's composed of 50% chosen by the coalition, 50% chosen by the opposition. It seems pretty fair, even though the government holds more than 50% of the current seats in the Knesset. What the opposition is saying, like the ones that Bennett and Lapid is saying, oh, no. We don't want the government to have any stake in putting together this commission of inquiry. And we want this commission of inquiry to be selected by the court. And we want it to be a retired Supreme Court justice at the head of the panel. And the reason why they want to do that is because they know that the government was attacking the court, and the court is constantly operating against the government.
Right.
And what the protesters want is they want a commission of inquiry that is going to, okay, yes, some blame maybe in the military, some blame maybe in the intelligence, for sure. Maybe the court did, the judicial reform protest, maybe that contributed a little, but really responsibility, the buck has to stop with the prime minister. That's what the commission of inquiry that the opposition wants, what the protesters want. They want a commission of inquiry that is going to be so hard against the government that Israeli voters will either push Netanyahu to resign as a result of what happened on October 7th, or that the voters will simply vote for their preferred candidate in the next election scheduled in a year from now. Obviously, Netanyahu wants to run again. He doesn't want that commission of inquiry. He wants a more broad-based commission of inquiry, which is going to heap a lot of the responsibility on the military, the upper echelons of the military and the intelligence community for failing the government and failing the people on October 7th.
And the protests will continue. They'll continue, I don't know, through the elections, as long as Netanyahu's in
And just
power.
watch, by the way, because
they'll still go on.
just right now they're calling for a commission of inquiry. If they see that this no longer polls well in focus testing, they will just switch
Milk prices, something, cottage cheese.
Something else will happen, and that will be the new silver bullet for the protest movement.
We're almost out of time, Alex, but I want to turn our focus in the last several minutes here to New York City. You had Zohran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York, and this incident at Park East Synagogue in Manhattan. There was actually a Nefesh B'Nefesh event. Nefesh B'Nefesh, an organization that helps Jews move to Israel, make Aliyah to Israel. They help in all sorts of ways. You had protesters outside this event at a synagogue cheering to globalize the Intifada, essentially to murder Jews all over the world. And Mamdani referred to the event taking place inside as a violation of international law. That's how he views a Nefesh B'Nefesh event. He also met with President Trump. We'll get to that. But what do you think of this event at a synagogue with the mayor-elect?
Well, I think you understand, what the mayor-elect is all about. I mean, he's saying that a fair, basically, like where Jews that are interested in moving to Israel, and there are hundreds of thousands of American Jews living in Israel. Okay, in fact, I think that Israel is the second largest expatriate community of Americans living in any other country next to Mexico. I think it's the second, it might be the third. But for a tiny country of just 10 million people to have hundreds of thousands of American citizens moving out of America into Israel, like you, like me, this has been something that's been going on for decades. And for the mayor of New York to say that this is a violation of international law, I mean, it's a slippery slope, because if he says that international law is being violated, could he send in police at some point to break into a future event in a synagogue and arrest the organizers of Nefesh B'Nefesh for violations of international law? I mean, you're seeing that the mayor of New York is not so much interested in domestic affairs, that he rather has like an agenda that's larger than just making New York City more affordable for its citizens. At the same time, I mean, he did go and say, well, houses of worship should be places where people can walk in without being intimidated. Of course, did he call for the police to break it up and to arrest the people that were intimidating those who were going inside? It was just a statement that he made on the outside. So I think it's dangerous if you're going to see that pro-Hamas globalize the Intifada, globalize the jihad. Protesters are going to be allowed to protest outside synagogues without police intervention. I think it's going to become a dangerous situation for American Jews living in New York City.
Alex, what should we then make of the meeting between President Trump and Mayor-elect Mamdani, which was described by the president as a great meeting? Let's check out this video.
We've just had a great meeting, a really good, very productive meeting. We have one thing in common. We want this city of ours that we love to do very well.
So there's something I don't know if I thought I would see. I mean, you had Mamdani, who in the past referred to Trump as a fascist, meeting with the president. It looks like the president's really willing to meet with anyone, whether it's China, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whatever it is. He looks like he's willing to have a meeting with anybody.
Mamdani didn't just call Trump a fascist in the past, right? A reporter asked Mamdani in the White House about him calling the president a fascist. And, Mamdani was about to, kind of explain it away in some kind of diplomatic, diplo speak, whatever. And Trump said, no, you just say yes.
Right.
And Mamdani said, yes. He said, yes, I did call him a fascist. Right. And he still, I'm sure, thinks that that the president is a fascist.
So why the
Trump,
meeting? Yeah.
Not only did they meet, but Trump said that they shared more in common than he thought, that he's a smart guy, that he won an election against good candidates, and basically stating that he was going to work with Mamdani to make New York City the best that could be made. And when just a couple of weeks before, Trump was saying the most terrible things about Mamdani, I think this is a strategy of Trump trying to embrace his enemies. You're seeing it with China, you're seeing it with Putin, you're seeing it with Qatar and with Turkey. Now you're seeing it with Mamdani. And I think that there's a problem here because Trump is not able to play a long game on this, right? We're talking about 3 years more in office, not the possibility of 8 years. And I think that the American people are looking for moral clarity from the president of the United States. And if all of a sudden the president of the United States is saying, well, yeah, I said those things in the campaign, but really, I guess Mamdani's a good guy. He's basically telling his base that Mamdani's a good guy. He's telling his base that the Qataris are good actors, that Erdogan is a friend. I think that these mixed signals are dangerous. I think that really what the president is being counted on is for a bit of moral clarity here with regard to who are America's friends, who are America's enemies. Some of those friends are allies abroad, and some of those enemies are abroad, and some of those enemies are also within.
To be continued. Let's see who the president meets with next. We will certainly monitor that. And of course, everything going on in Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world here on Jerusalem Minute from JNS TV. Josh Haston here, correspondent for JNS. Alex Trayman, CEO of JNS. Want to give a shout out to the people behind the cameras here. Yuri Svretsky, station manager. Ryan Lishitz, Esther Eden, and our producer, Zach Sickerman. Have a great week, everybody. Go to JNS TV for all the amazing content provided by JNS. And of course, JNS.org for all the latest news from Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world. We'll see you next week on Jerusalem Minute.